Imagine for a second that you possess a superpower.
Oh, a superpower. Okay.
Yeah, but it's not like flying, and it's definitely not invisibility. Your superpower is that you know exactly what every single person on Earth wants to buy.
Wow.
Right. And not just what they want, but the exact moment they want to buy it and precisely the maximum dollar amount they're willing to part with to get it.
Sounds like magic, right?
I mean, yeah, it would be the absolute holy grail for any global bonus because, the reality we actually live in is just the polar opposite of that.
Right.
We're dealing with human behavior, and human behavior is messy. It's deeply emotional, highly reactive, and it's constantly shifting based on variables we can barely track, let alone actually predict.
Which is exactly why we are plunging into this custom-tailored deep dive just for you today. We are unpacking the incredibly high-stakes, largely invisible world of supply chain demand.
It really is invisible to most people. Totally. So the mission of this deep dive is to figure out how massive organizations attempt to mimic that exact superpower. How do they, reverse engineer what you want, when you want it, and then somehow align these massive, grinding, multi-continent gears of global supply chains to actually deliver it.
And do it without completely bankrupting themselves in the process.
Exactly, without going bankrupt.
So today is fundamentally about a transition, I think.
Right.
We're moving past this old era where supply chains simply reacted to a market that surprised them.
Right.
We are entering this realm where organizations proactively understand, anticipate, and if they are sophisticated enough, actively shape that market.
And we're going to strip down the mechanics of everything, from the art of predicting irrational human behavior to the pretty unforgiving mathematics of microeconomics. So here is the big question I want you to ponder as we navigate this. How do global behemoths avoid drowning in billions of dollars of excess inventory on one hand?
Yeah.
Or completely running out of critical stock when a global crisis hits on the other?
Well, to even begin answering that, we really have to start at the bedrock of corporate strategy, which is demand analysis.
Demand analysis, okay.
Right. If an organization has any intention of surviving its first decade, it has to look at itself in relation to its external environment. It's not just a cursory glance at sales figures,
Deeper than that.
Much deeper. It's the critical diagnostic process that determines everything a company will execute. Across the long-term strategic horizon, the medium-term tactical adjustments, and, down to the granular short-term operational day-to-day.
Let's contextualize that, because I think it's really easy to assume a company with a great product will just naturally succeed.
Oh, absolutely.
But you can build the most ruthlessly efficient, automated, cost-effective manufacturing process in human history. And if you haven't done your demand analysis, that hyper-efficient supply chain is really just a massive liability.
Precisely. Because you're optimizing for a vacuum.
Right.
If a harsh economic climate settles in or consumer tastes pivot overnight due to some viral trend,
like a TikTok video or something.
Exactly. Or a new sweeping government regulation effectively bans your core material. Your efficiency means nothing in those scenarios. The overarching goal of demand analysis isn't just to maximize throughput, it's to engineer flexibility.
Flexibility.
Yeah, you're building a nervous system that can process external shocks and adapt the physical supply chain in real time.
It reminds me of that classic architectural blunder. You wouldn't pour the foundation for this gorgeous, sprawling glass mansion without doing a geological survey of the soil, right?
No, of course not.
Or looking at the local weather patterns.
Yeah.
Because if you build that glass masterpiece in a Category 5 hurricane zone without integrating storm shutters or reinforced framing, you haven't built a great house.
Right.
You've built a multi-million-dollar shrapnel grenade just waiting for the wind to blow.
That's a great way to put it. And the hurricane, in that analogy, represents the macro environment. This is a vital distinction in demand analysis.
Okay, lay it out for us.
It's the separation between what an organization can control and what is entirely out of its hands. Because no single organization, no matter how much market cap it has, can control technological paradigm shifts or sudden global economic crash.
Or massive regulatory forces. You just cannot control the macro.
Exactly. You can't control the macro.
But you can control the micro. You can't stop the recession, but you have absolute control over your tactical and operational levers.
Right, your own internal levers.
Yeah, you can alter your pricing architecture or launch hyper-targeted promotions to clear out aging inventory or strategically prioritize which of your Tier 1 customers actually get your limited supply when a shortage hits.
You survive the macro by ruthlessly managing the micro. But to know which micro levers to pull, an organization first has to undergo a pretty brutal, unfiltered self-assessment.
Which brings us to the SWOT analysis. Now, I have to pause here because I know you, listening to this, have probably sat through a dozen corporate retreats where someone draws a 4-quadrant matrix on a whiteboard, right?
Oh, yeah. The classic whiteboard grid.
Yeah. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It feels like an antiquated exercise from some 1990s business school textbook.
It really does.
I mean, we have real-time digital sales tracking, predictive algorithmic AI, and global sentiment analysis. Why on earth are companies still relying on a basic 4-square grid to tell them what their weaknesses are?
It's a completely fair critique. And honestly, if a SWOT analysis is just used as a corporate team-building exercise, it's totally useless.
Right.
But the reason it persists and why it remains critical for supply chain validation is that predictive AI and real-time sales trackers only extrapolate from past data.
Oh.
They're inherently backward-looking, or they're narrowly focused on current mathematical trends. A rigorous SWOT analysis forces human intelligence to synthesize qualitative data and acknowledge external realities that, frankly, algorithms often miss.
So it bridges the gap between the internal physical capabilities of your supply chain and the external qualitative realities of the market. So it's less about calculating margin degradation and more about finding the blind spots the algorithm just doesn't know to look for.
Yeah.
Because strengths and weaknesses are focused purely inward, right?
Yes, exactly.
You're auditing your employee skill sets, the physical vulnerabilities of where your facilities are located, your proprietary tech, and the actual durability of your brand reputation.
While opportunities and threats demand aggressive environmental scanning, you're looking at demographic shifts that haven't actually hit your sales yet.
Like looking down the road.
Right. You're anticipating new carbon taxes being debated in a foreign legislature that will impact your raw material costs in, say, 3 years. You're analyzing competitor maneuvers. Because, sales numbers won't trigger an alert that a rival is quietly buying up land next to your primary distribution hub.
Wow, that makes the internal versus external dynamic really clear. Like a spike in customer complaints about returns might highlight a critical internal weakness in your reverse logistics.
Exactly.
Something your sales team is actively ignoring because they only care about outbound volume, right? They just want to sell.
Yeah, they're focused on their own metrics.
So SWOT forces the entire organization to look at the threat before it paralyzes the chain. But identifying the threat is only half the battle. Actually navigating those threats and capitalizing on the opportunities requires stepping out of the boardroom and actively listening to the people swiping their credit cards.
Which seamlessly transitions us into market research.
Right.
If demand analysis is the foundational blueprint, market research is the sensory organ of the supply chain. It acts as the crucial, often fraught liaison between the engineering teams who dream up and assemble a product and the actual end consumers who have to integrate it into their lives.
Because engineers are prone to building things that are technically brilliant but practically useless, right?
Oh, constantly. Market research exists to align that brilliance with actual consumer friction points.
And all the gathered intelligence is formalized into a market plan, which effectively dictates the physical geometry of the supply chain itself. Where you pour concrete for a new factory isn't just about finding the cheapest real estate or the lowest corporate tax rate.
No, not at all.
It is entirely subservient to where your market plan says your future demand is going to cluster.
A perfect illustration of this is Tesla's strategic footprint.
Oh, the Tesla example, yeah.
When their market research indicated that Europe was going to aggressively adopt EVs, becoming a primary sustained source of demand, their supply chain response wasn't just to ramp up production in California and put more finished cars on boats.
Right.
They established assembly operations in Tilburg in the Netherlands.
Because shipping fully assembled vehicles across the Atlantic is incredibly inefficient. You are basically paying a premium to ship empty air inside the cabin of the car.
Yes, you're paying for the space.
By shipping the dense individual components and doing the final assembly in the Netherlands, you drastically reduce your transportation volume requirements. Plus, you sidestep the crippling import duties that are typically slapped on finished imported goods.
It is the physical manifestation of market research. And to get to that level of operational clarity, supply chains rely on 3 distinct layers of research.
Okay, let's break those down.
First, there's market analysis, which is the macro view, studying the total size, geographic distribution and demographic characteristics of the market itself.
Got it.
Second is sales analysis, which narrows the focus to market share. What specific slice of that total pie do we actually dominate, and where are we losing ground?
And then the third layer is consumer research, which is where we really get into the psychology. We're analyzing consumer attitudes, their emotional reactions to the product, and the underlying, often irrational motivations driving their purchasing decisions.
And when you fuse deep consumer research with aggressive competitor scanning, you get profound supply chain pivots. The hair example is a masterclass in this.
Oh man, I was hoping we'd get to hair. This is such a good story. When this massive appliance manufacturer decided to penetrate the African market, specifically Nigeria, they could have taken the easy route.
They really could have.
They could have just diverted a few container ships full of their standard global market refrigerators, dumped them in Legos, and hoped their brand name carried the day. But their consumer research teams actually embedded in the environment and identified a massive, overarching threat to their product's utility.
The local power grid.
Exactly. Frequent prolonged power outages were a daily reality for consumers. A standard fridge in that environment isn't a convenience. It's a liability that just lets your food rot.
So the supply chain triumph here isn't just about clever marketing, right? It required a total re-engineering of the product and its component sourcing.
Wow.
Hare developed a specialized frost-free refrigerator, specifically insulated and engineered to keep contents frozen for an astounding 100 hours without active power.
100 hours? That's insane.
They listened to a specific, localized external threat, unreliable electricity, and transformed it into a dominant competitive advantage, capturing massive market share in the region.
But the truly brilliant part is their operational whiplash. When Hare subsequently pivoted to attack the United States market, they didn't bring the 100-hour off-grid freezer.
No, that would make no sense there.
It would be a complete mismatch for the U.S. consumer profile. Instead, their market research dictated a completely different strategy. They abandoned the niche engineering angle and focused purely on volume and distribution, securing massive exclusive contracts with retail behemoths like Best Buy, Home Depot, and Walmart to force their way into the American consciousness.
It perfectly encapsulates how a global brand must maintain a highly adaptable, localized supply chain execution. But, that same global connectedness introduces extreme fragility.
Oh, for sure.
A disruption in a single hyper-localized node can immediately metastasize across the entire global web.
We've seen this happen with terrifying speed. Think back to the 2011 Fukushima earthquake and tsunami. In the immediate aftermath, it was a profound, localized human tragedy.
It was devastating.
But within a matter of weeks, because of how deeply concentrated certain Tier 2 and Tier 3 manufacturing had become in that specific region of Japan, it threatened the global supply of auto parts, consumer electronics, and specialized machine tools. Companies on the other side of the planet had to halt assembly lines because a factory they didn't even know they relied on was underwater.
And we witnessed an even more dramatic iteration of this with the Ever Given ship blocking the Suez Canal.
Oh, right. A single massive container ship gets wedged sideways in the dirt, and suddenly billions of dollars of global trade are paralyzed.
It was wild to watch.
It wasn't just a traffic jam. It was a heart attack for the global supply chain. It proved that your market research and demand planning must account for physical, geographic choke points. You can forecast European demand perfectly, but if your components are stuck behind a boat in Egypt, your forecast is useless.
It forces a brutal reckoning with risk. We saw similar collaborative survival tactics during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right, yeah.
When demand for respirators and ICU beds exploded exponentially, localized hospitals couldn't just rely on their standard procurement channels. The bottlenecks were too severe.
They're just completely overwhelmed.
Exactly. They were forced to centrally coordinate, sharing vital inventory data and supply lines, even with their direct market competitors, just to keep the system from collapsing.
Which proves that in the modern supply chain, strategic cooperation is often just as critical as competition. But let's look at the flip side of this localized customization. Understanding the global customer is incredibly powerful, and building a 100-hour freezer for Nigeria is brilliant.
Right.
But what happens when a company takes this logic too far? What happens when a brand tries to offer a highly customized variation of a product for every single micro-demographic they've researched?
You step right into the trap of product assessments, specifically the nightmare of product portfolio complexity management.
Think of it like a restaurant menu. We've all been to that diner with a massive 20-page menu that offers everything from pancakes to sushi.
Oh, I hate those places.
Right. As a diner, it seems fantastic. Endless choice. But for the kitchen, it is an operational hellscape. They have to keep 100 different highly perishable ingredients fresh. The line cooks are psychologically fatigued, trying to remember 50 disparate recipes. And as a result, the ticket times slow to an absolute crawl and the quality drops.
Yeah.
In the supply chain world, those menu items are SCIS stock-keeping units.
The restaurant analogy perfectly captures the friction between revenue generation and operational efficiency. Initially, when a company begins proliferating, say, taking a single successful laptop model and suddenly offering it in 5 different colors, with 3 different storage capacities and 2 different screen finishes.
It sounds great on paper.
It does,
Yeah.
and it genuinely drives up top-line revenue. You are capturing a wider, more fragmented audience who wants exactly their specific configuration.
But you hit a tipping point on what you call the complexity cost curve.
Exactly. There is a mathematical threshold where offering too many SKUs begins to actively destroy your manufacturing economies of scale.
How so?
Well, on the factory floor, you can no longer run a single line continuously for a week. You have to constantly halt the assembly line to swap out paint colors or retool the chassis molds. That downtime is pure burn capital.
Not to mention the procurement nightmare. Instead of negotiating a massive, cheap bulk order for one type of aluminum casing, you are buying 20 different smaller batches of specialized materials, which completely destroys your purchasing leverage.
Yeah.
And your warehousing costs skyrocket because to guarantee availability, you have to stock a buffer of all 50 laptop variations in every single regional distribution center.
And it ultimately dilutes your marketing focus. You're spending ad dollars trying to explain minor technical differences rather than selling the core brand promise. Eventually, the hidden costs of managing that complexity outpace the incremental revenue the new SKUs bring in.
So you're losing money on them.
Exactly. Your total revenue might technically still be growing, but your profit margins are in free fall.
So the entire discipline of product assessment is about finding that razor-thin sweet spot. You are basically acting as the mediator in a perpetual corporate civil war.
That's very true.
On one side, you have the operations team, whose ultimate fantasy is to produce exactly one single SKU in one color in massive, uninterrupted, ruthlessly efficient runs. And on the other side, you have the marketing and sales teams, who ideally want 1 million different SKUs so they never, ever have to tell a potential customer no.
And identifying where you sit on that complexity curve depends heavily on where the specific product currently resides in its product life cycle.
Okay, the old life cycle.
Right. A formal review looks at the 4 distinct stages: introduction, growth, maturity, and decline. What is truly fascinating from a logistics perspective is how the physical architecture of the supply chain must radically morph to support each stage.
So if a product hits the growth phase, it's going viral. Sales volume is accelerating rapidly week over week. What does the supply chain do?
It shifts into an aggressive make-to-stock strategy. The mandate here is market capture. You need to build up massive inventory buffers and push them out to forward-deployed distribution centers.
Because if they can't buy it now, they'll buy something else.
Exactly. If a customer wants it, it must be on the shelf immediately, because if you're out of stock, they will buy a competitor's product and you lose that lifetime value. Availability and speed are your primary competitive attributes, and you are willing to incur higher logistics costs to guarantee them.
But contrast that with a product that has entered decline. The new model has been announced, and the legacy product's sales are dropping steadily. You cannot use a make-to-stock strategy here, or you will end up with warehouses stuffed with obsolete plastic that you eventually have to write off as a total loss.
Exactly. The strategy completely inverts. You enact a low-cost phase-out plan. You might transition to a lean make-to-order strategy where you only produce a unit when a confirmed purchase order comes in.
Oh, wow.
And critically, this is where reverse logistics becomes paramount. You need a system in place to handle the recycling, refurbishing, or safe ecological dispersal of the legacy product as it phases out of the market.
So the supply chain literally shapeshifts depending on the age of the product. But a product's life cycle doesn't play out in a sterile laboratory. It lives or dies inside a chaotic global economy. To truly understand the forces acting on demand, we have to zoom all the way out from the individual SKU and look at the massive atmospheric pressures of macroeconomics.
Macroeconomics shifts our focus from the individual company to the aggregate behavior of the overall economy. We are looking at aggregate supply and aggregate demand, the total sum of every good and service being produced and consumed across an entire nation or global bloc.
And the ultimate scorecard for that is gross domestic product, or GDP. But what's crucial to understand for supply chain planning is that GDP doesn't just grow in a smooth, predictable straight line.
No, it certainly doesn't.
It moves in these massive, violent, wave-like cycles of expansion and recession. If human demand is generally infinite, why do we have these crushing cyclical waves?
It is a profound, self-correcting cycle of cause and effect driven by the lag in supply chains. During an economic expansion, optimism is high, businesses are investing, employment is robust, and consumer spending is accelerating.
Sounds good so far.
Right. But as this aggregate demand begins to outstrip the available aggregate supply, the weighted average prices of goods and services start to climb.
Because there's too much money chasing too few goods.
Exactly. But here's the supply chain trap. Suppliers see these high prices and massive demand, so they aggressively ramp up their production capacity. They build new factories, hire third shifts, and flood the market with goods to capture those high margins.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But they're operating on a delay. By the time that massive new wave of supply actually hits the market, those elevated prices have quietly eroded the consumer's purchasing power. People simply cannot afford to buy at the same velocity anymore.
Oh man, it's a catastrophic collision. The exact moment the supply chain hits maximum output is the exact moment consumer demand collapses under the weight of high prices.
And that collision creates a massive surplus. Supply vastly outstrips demand. To liquidate the mounting inventory, companies are forced to slash prices, which obliterates their profit margins. To survive, they initiate mass layoffs.
Wow.
Those newly unemployed consumers immediately halt their spending, which triggers a broader recession.
But the wave doesn't stay at the bottom forever. As prices fall lower and lower and factories sit idle, the surplus eventually clears. Goods become highly affordable again. Eventually, those low prices stimulate renewed demand, consumers start buying, factories spin back up, and the recovery begins its upward climb.
And suspended right in the middle of those wild, destructive swings is the theoretical concept of equilibrium. It's the economic holy grail where aggregate supply perfectly matches aggregate demand, prices remain perfectly stable, and the economy hits what economists call full employment.
Though full employment is a bit of a misnomer, because it doesn't mean literally 0% unemployment. A healthy economy actually requires a base level of joblessness.
It does. Equilibrium accounts for the natural friction inherent in a dynamic labor market. You have frictional unemployment, which is completely normal and healthy, like a recent engineering grad taking 4 months to find the right firm, or a manager voluntarily quitting to negotiate a better salary across town.
Right.
Then you have structural unemployment, which occurs when the fundamental structure of the economy shifts. Think of legacy auto workers needing 6 months of retraining to learn how to assemble EV batteries. Full employment simply means that everyone who actively wants a job can secure one, factoring in those necessary transition periods.
The real terror for supply chains, though, is when the economy detaches from equilibrium and we enter severe inflation or deflation. How do supply chain managers actually measure when prices are quietly spiraling out of control before it hits their bottom line?
They monitor highly specific economic indicators, primarily the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. The CPI tracks the month-over-month price changes of a massive standardized basket of consumer goods. If the cost of that basket rises persistently, you have inflation, too much capital chasing scarce supply. If it drops, you have deflation.
But looking at CPI is often looking in the rearview mirror, right?
Exactly. To actually navigate, supply chains divide their radar into leading and lagging indicators.
Leading indicators are the crystal ball. They are the metrics that shift before the broader economy does. A classic example is building permits issued for new residential housing. You don't look at houses currently being built, you look at the paperwork being filed.
Yeah.
If new building permits plummet in October, you know with near certainty that the entire construction industry and all the supply chains that feed it is going to hit a brick wall 6 months later. Initial unemployment claims and the momentum of the S&P 500 stock index serve a similar predictive function.
Lagging indicators, conversely, exist to validate the trends that the leading indicators suggested. The overall national unemployment rate is the most famous lagging indicator. It almost never signals a recession. It only spikes after the economic damage has already been done for several quarters.
Interesting.
Outstanding business loans and aggregate inventory to sales ratios act similarly. They are the hard data that confirm the economic shift has officially arrived.
But the metric that truly fascinates me, the one that proves economics, is as much psychology as it is math, is the Consumer Confidence Index, the CCI. We build these incredibly rigorous, mathematically pure supply chain models, and yet one of the most powerful leading indicators is literally a poll measuring irrational human emotion.
It really is.
The CCI just asked thousands of people, how optimistic do you feel about the future? And the terrifying reality is that if people feel poor, even if their bank accounts haven't changed and their jobs are secure, they will defensively alter their buying patterns. They stop spending, demand drops, factories lay people off, and their irrational fear becomes a self-fulfilling economic reality.
It is the ultimate testament to the fragility of markets. They run on sentiment. And the practical application of this for a supply chain manager is immense. If you are managing a global hardware manufacturer and you see a sustained drop in those leading housing permits and a dip in the CCI, you do not wait for your sales to collapse.
You act now.
You proactively intercept the wave. You immediately instruct your raw material suppliers to pivot. You shift your factory capacity away from producing bulk materials for new home construction, and you retool to produce materials for home renovation and repair.
Oh, because historical data proves that when consumers are too scared to buy a new house, they hunker down and repair their existing one.
Exactly. You survive the macro wave by perfectly timing your micro pivot.
Which is the perfect transition. We've surveyed the massive aggregate forest of macroeconomics. Now we need to zoom in with a microscope and examine the individual trees. We are entering the domain of microeconomics.
If macroeconomics deals with the aggregate sum of a nation, microeconomics focuses ruthlessly on the behavior of individual economic decision makers. It attempts to quantify exactly how a change in a specific variable, usually price, impacts the demand for one singular product.
Now, we all know the fundamental gravity of pricing. You raise the price of a luxury car, fewer people can afford it, demand goes down. You lower the price, demand goes up. But what makes microeconomics so critical for supply chain logistics is that not all products obey that law with the same intensity. This is the concept of price elasticity.
The shape of a product's elasticity curve dictates its entire supply chain strategy. You have to definitively categorize your product as elastic or inelastic.
And the distinction is profound. Innovative, luxury, or highly substitutable products like a new 8K television or a premium smartphone are highly elastic. If the price of that smartphone suddenly spikes by 40%, consumer demand will absolutely crater.
Right, because nobody needs an 8K TV.
It's exactly. The market is hypersensitive to the price point because the product isn't strictly necessary. But staple goods and critical services are deeply inelastic. If the price of milk or eggs doubles, consumers will be furious. They will complain bitterly, but they will still put it in their cart.
Yeah.
Or consider medical services. If you need an emergency appendectomy, you are not price shopping or waiting for a Black Friday discount. You consume the service regardless of the astronomical price change.
To empirically determine where your specific product falls, supply chain planners use a vital calculation called the total revenue test. It's a fundamental exercise in margin versus volume. Imagine you aggressively cut the price of your product. You are intentionally taking a hit. You are making significantly less profit margin on every single unit sold.
Right.
But if that lower price triggers such a massive, overwhelming surge in total sales volume that your overall gross revenue actually exceeds what you were making before the price cut, your product is highly elastic. The market responded violently to the discount.
If, however, you drop the price and your total revenue shrinks because the handful of new customers you gained didn't generate enough cash to cover the margin you voluntarily sacrificed, your product is inelastic. Lowering the price was a strategic failure.
Understanding that elasticity is the prerequisite for one of the most powerful and often misunderstood concepts in supply chain pricing, marginal analysis.
This concept completely rewired how I look at logistics and profitability. Let's build an analogy. Imagine you are driving your personal car alone across the country. You have already absorbed the cost of the car, the annual insurance premium, and you are paying for the tank of gas to get from point A to point B.
Okay, with you.
If a friend asks to ride shotgun and offers to chip in $20 for the trip, does adding that passenger cost you a whole new car? Does it double your insurance? No.
No, of course not.
The car, the insurance, and the baseline fuel are sunk costs. You are spending that money regardless of whether the passenger seat is empty or full. The only truly new cost you incur, the marginal cost, is the microscopic fraction of extra gas required to move their specific physical weight.
That intuition translates perfectly to commercial logistics and is where uneducated managers leave millions of dollars on the table. Consider a standard long-haul trucking scenario. A carrier runs a route between two major distribution centers.
Okay.
The total cost to run that truck, paying the driver, the depreciation on the rig, the insurance, the bulk of the diesel fuel is 1,000 euros. The truck can hold 10,000 kilograms of freight. So the average cost to move that freight is 10 cents per kilogram.
Okay, the baseline is 10 cents a kilo. Now imagine the truck is only loaded with 8,000 kilos. There is empty space in the trailer. A third-party broker calls and offers to fill that remaining unused space, but they're only willing to pay 5 cents a kilogram. If you are a manager looking purely at your average cost of 10 cents, you reject that offer instantly, right? You assume you'd be losing 5 cents on every kilo.
Instinctively, yes. But marginal analysis dictates that rejecting it is a massive financial error. You must separate the sunk costs from the marginal costs.
Okay.
The 1,000 euros for the driver in the truck dispatch is a sunk cost. You have already committed to spending that money the moment the truck leaves the yard, whether it is 80% full or 100% full.
The marginal cost, the literal cost of adding those specific extra pallets, is practically zero. It's just the marginal decrease in fuel efficiency from dragging a slightly heavier trailer. Maybe that marginal fuel cost equates to 2 cents per kilogram.
Exactly. So your true marginal cost is 2 cents. The broker is offering you 5 cents. Therefore, accepting that heavily discounted freight actually yields a marginal net benefit of 3 cents per kilogram. It is pure, unadulterated profit layered on top of a trip you were already forced to make.
The implication for the supply chain is staggering. A failure to understand microeconomics specifically, failing to accurately isolate the true marginal costs of logistics, warehousing, and distribution will lead a company to systematically misprice their services.
Every single time.
They will reject highly profitable business opportunities because their accounting software is blinding them with average sunk costs.
You must weaponize marginal analysis in your logistics, or you are artificially capping your profitability.
Okay, so mastering the mathematical laws of microeconomics gives you an incredible edge in pricing strategy. But if you are the manager of a regional distribution center, knowing the elasticity curve of your product doesn't help you figure out how many forklift drivers to schedule for next Tuesday morning. To actually run the physical operations, you need to map out the messy, granular, boots-on-the-ground patterns of human buying behavior. Let's pivot into short to medium-term demand patterns.
Everything we've discussed so far heavily influences what we call base demand, the long-term theoretical average of what you expect to sell. But anyone who has ever run a business knows that reality does not operate on a smooth average. It fluctuates wildly from day to day, week to week. To accurately forecast what a factory needs to produce and what a warehouse needs to staff, a supply chain analyst has to take a massive chaotic jumble of raw sales data and meticulously extract the specific hidden patterns driving the fluctuation.
We can break this noise down into 5 distinct mathematical patterns. The first is trend. This is the overarching long-term upward or downward trajectory of the data. It can be linear, just a steady, predictable climb as brand awareness grows, or it can be exponential, like a viral product suddenly experiencing parabolic demand.
The second pattern is cycles. We touched on these when discussing macroeconomics. These are the prolonged, multi-year, wave-like patterns inherently tied to the broader economic expansions and recessions. They are notoriously difficult to factor into short-term forecasting because their turning points unfold over years, not weeks.
The third pattern is seasonality. And I want to pause and clarify this, because the common assumption is that seasonality just means selling more snow shovels in December and more sunscreen in July. But in supply chain analytics, seasonality is defined strictly as any predictable, repeating, calendar-related pattern, regardless of the timescale.
That is a critical distinction. Seasonality isn't just meteorological, it can be hyper-compressed down to the hour. Think of the service industry, specifically fast food logistics.
Oh, yeah.
They forecast their demand down to the 15-minute increment. They know with absolute certainty that a massive spike in demand hits between 11:30 a.m. and 1:15 p.m. every single weekday.
The lunch rush is literally a season in their forecasting model. They staff up the kitchen, pre-stage specific high-velocity menu items, and alter their entire operational flow to survive that specific 2-hour window, completely differently than how they operate during a slow Tuesday at 3:00 p.m.
The fourth pattern introduces a dangerous variable: promotions. These are the internal, artificial drivers of demand. When your marketing department blasts out a 20% off digital coupon or runs a buy one get one free weekend, demand inevitably spikes.
Naturally.
What is vital to understand is the magnitude of this distortion. In certain highly competitive consumer goods industries, internal promotions can explain anywhere from 50% to 80% of all sales variation.
Which means the massive spike in your sales data isn't a natural trend of people suddenly loving your product more. It's just the raw result of your own advertising dollars buying volume.
And this is where forecasting algorithms frequently fail. If your analytics team doesn't meticulously tag and scrub that promotional spike out of your historical baseline data, your algorithm will look at last November's massive sales peak, assume it was a natural organic trend, and forecast it to happen again naturally this year.
Oh, wow.
You will drastically overproduce, completely blind to the fact that the only reason it happened last year was because you artificially subsidized the price.
Which leaves us with the fifth and final pattern. Random variation. This is the chaotic, unpredictable static leftover after you have cleanly extracted the trends, the multi-year cycles, the seasonal rhythms, and the promotional spikes. It is the pure noise of daily human existence.
In the discipline of statistical process control, we separate out special causes from common causes. Trends, seasons, and promotions are special causes. We can identify their origin and actively plan for them. Random variation is a common cause.
Right.
It is the invisible culmination of 1,000 tiny, unmeasurable variables. A local traffic jam, a sudden rainstorm, a minor shift in a competitor's ad spend that causes your daily demand to twitch slightly up or down. You cannot predict it. Attempting to do so is a fool's errand. You simply have to build enough physical inventory buffer into your supply chain to absorb it without breaking.
And all of this complex mathematics, all this pattern extraction and algorithmic modeling ultimately leads us to the most humbling, universally acknowledged golden rule of supply chain forecasting. Forecasts are almost always wrong.
It is the bitterest pill for any C-suite executive to swallow. No matter how sophisticated your neural networks are, no matter how clean your data lake is, a forecast is ultimately just a highly educated guess about a future that hasn't materialized yet.
So this begs the obvious question. If we concede that every forecast we ever generate is mathematically guaranteed to be wrong, why do massive corporations dedicate entire sprawling departments, millions of dollars in software licenses, and countless hours to building them? Why not just embrace the chaos and react in real time?
Because the objective of forecasting isn't to achieve absolute perfection, it is to systematically compress the margin of error. If you abandon forecasting, or if your forecast is deeply flawed and siloed, you open your entire network up to the most destructive phenomenon in logistics, the bullwhip effect.
We have to unpack the bullwhip effect because the mechanics of it are absolutely terrifying. It's how a tiny ripple of consumer behavior turns into a corporate tsunami.
Imagine a scenario where a local retailer experiences a minor, entirely random 5% spike in demand for a specific brand of toothpaste. It's just random variation. But the store manager gets nervous about stocking out, so just to be safe, they order 10% more from their regional distributor.
So the distortion begins.
Exactly. Now the regional distributor sees a sudden 10% jump in orders from the retailer. The distributor's algorithm flags this as an emerging trend. Not wanting to be caught short, the distributor pads their own safety stock and places an order for 20% more product from the manufacturer.
The manufacturer looks at their dashboard, sees a massive 20% spike in wholesale orders, panics, assumes the product is going viral, and immediately spins up a new production line, ordering 40% more raw materials from their suppliers.
A microscopic 5% twitch at the retail checkout counter has been amplified by fear and isolated decision-making into a massive, destructive whiplash of overordering upstream. By the time the raw materials are refined, packaged, and shipped back down the chain, that initial 5% retail spike has long since vanished. Now, the entire supply chain from the manufacturer down to the retailer is choking on mountains of excess, unsellable inventory. Cash flow is frozen, warehouses are overflowing, and the bullwhip has struck.
So how does a modern, sophisticated organization mathematically neutralize the bullwhip? If the root cause is isolated teams panic ordering based on distorted signals, the solution has to be forced alignment, right?
Precisely. You cure the bullwhip through a rigorous, often highly political process called Sales and Operations Planning, or S&OP. The goal of S&OP is to establish a one-number system.
Because without it, every department acts like a hostile fiefdom. The sales team naturally generates wildly optimistic forecasts because they never want to lose a commission due to a stockout, Meanwhile, the finance department generates a deeply pessimistic forecast because they want to minimize inventory holding costs and protect cash flow.
Exactly. S&OP forces those warring factions into a room. The entire organization, sales, marketing, operations, finance, and procurement, must look at the scrubbed demand patterns and hammer out one single unified consensus forecast.
That sounds intense.
It is effectively a hostage negotiation, but once that single number is agreed upon, everyone in the company, from the CMO designing the ad campaigns to the floor manager ordering raw aluminum, agrees to execute against that exact same number. The estimate is still technically wrong, but because the entire massive enterprise is acting in unison on the exact same data, the amplification of the bullwhip is neutralized.
That is incredible. Okay, let's take a deep breath and survey the sheer scope of the territory we've covered today. We started by scanning the macro horizon for existential threats using SWOT analysis. We embedded with the market research teams that engineered Hare's 100-hour off-grid freezer for the Nigerian market. And we mapped how the Ever Given blocking the Suez Canal proved the fragility of geographic choke points. We navigated the brutal operations versus marketing civil war over SKU complexity in the restaurant menu. We tracked the massive macroeconomic waves of GDP, hacked logistics pricing by separating sunk costs from marginal costs, and finally, we broke down the precise hour-by-hour seasonal rhythms of the fast food lunch rush to neutralize the terrifying cascade of the bullwhip effect.
We have thoroughly charted the evolution from a fragile supply chain that merely reacts to the world to a resilient, proactive engine that understands the deep mathematical and psychological mechanisms driving human behavior.
But I want to leave you, the listener, with one final, slightly unnerving thought to chew on as we wrap this up. We talk extensively about how internal promotions and advertising can drive 50 to 80% of a product's demand variation. But what happens if we take that capability to its absolute logical extreme?
It's a big question.
If we combine the ruthless mathematical power of microeconomic marginal pricing with real-time, hour-by-hour digital demand tracking, we cross a threshold. We move from merely forecasting what you want to actively algorithmically shaping what you want.
It's a profound shift in power. Imagine a near-future landscape where supply chains don't just sit back and react to your desires. Instead, they weaponize dynamic pricing algorithms and hyper-targeted, individualized digital promotions to subconsciously engineer your desires to match exactly what they need to sell.
Wow.
If a massive automated warehouse suddenly detects excess capacity of a specific blue laptop, the system doesn't wait for you to want it. The price drops algorithmically in real time. A highly customized ad dynamically generates and drops into your social feed, and suddenly you feel an intense, organic, burning desire to purchase a blue laptop.
It brings us full circle right back to our opening premise. If a massive global corporation possesses the superpower to know exactly what you're going to buy this afternoon, is it because their forecasting algorithms are so brilliant they perfectly predicted your behavior? Or is it because they have engineered the supply chain to gently, invisibly push you into making the exact choice that optimizes their margins? Ultimately, you have to ask yourself, are we driving the supply chain, or is the supply chain driving us?
It is a dynamic that every modern consumer and every strategic business leader needs to continuously reevaluate.
Thank you for joining us on this incredibly dense, custom-tailored deep dive into the hidden architecture of supply chain demand. Your willingness to explore the complex mechanics beneath the surface is what makes these deep dives so rewarding. Keep challenging assumptions, keep looking past the obvious, and try to look at the massive world of global commerce and your own daily buying habits with fresh, highly analytical eyes. We will catch you on the next deep dive.